For a log cabin block for mystery quilt, you're going to need your hoop scissors. You're going to need 3 strips of fabric, and you can refer to your instructions for the exact size of how to cut those widths. You're going to need a little square fabric from your sashing fabric. You're going to need your Vanish Light water-soluble thread, an embroidery bobbin thread. You're going to need your quilting thread and a matching bobbin, and your triangle cut of wool that's been prepped on the edges, your backing fabric, and of course your battleizer. And we have that in the hoop ready to go for the first step. Okay, I have my battleizer in the hoop and I'm ready for step 1. I also have water-soluble thread in the needle, embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and it's going to stitch a placement stitch right onto the battleizer. For step 2, you're going to take your prepared wool that has the edges pressed, and you are going to place it inside the placement stitch, and the machine will sew a zigzag to hold it in place. For step 3, we still have water-soluble thread in the needle, and we're going to sew our pattern onto the wool. Just remember to keep your finger in front of the foot, and that'll help avoid it getting caught. You can also raise your presser foot to its highest setting on your machine. For step 4, you're going to take a little tiny square of your sashing fabric, and you're going to place it over the center of your log cabin. And I'm going to peek underneath, make sure I have at least 1/4 of an inch on all the different sides, and it looks good. So we're going to tack that down using water-soluble thread. And then I'm going to trim these 2 sides so that I have 1/4 of an inch or a scant 1/4 inch of a seam allowance left. Okay, I'm just going to bring back our log cabin block or log cabin triangle, and usually, as you can see, we have 3 fabrics that are surrounding the center triangle. And since we have 3 fabrics that we're putting on the front of our block to do our piecing with, you're just going to make sure each fabric, like for instance this is fabric 2, this is my fabric 1, and my fabric 3. And I've just made each of the 3 sides have one of those fabrics. So I'm going to repeat that process again. So here's my fabric 2, this is the white background on the floral, and I'm going to place it right sides down with the raw edges even. I'm going to make sure that when I flip my block that it's sufficiently covered, because the angled sides do come out a ways because of the nature of a triangle. So just make sure that you're going at least 1/4 of an inch beyond where those are as far as where your extra fabric is. And I'm going to place this here. I have changed to regular thread, and I'm stitching my seam. And then for step 6, we're going to flip our fabric over, right sides up, and finger press it, smooth it out, and sew a tack down using that regular thread. And then you can trim all 3 sides to 1/4 of an inch. Okay, step 7, we're going to sew a seam here, so I will need another piece of fabric, right side down, raw edges even, taking care to note to make sure that once it's flipped, it's going to cover this corner over here. And step 8, I can flip my fabric right side up, finger press, and sew a tack down. And then I can trim seam allowances to 1/4 inch. Okay, I'm on step 9. I have all my seam allowances trimmed to 1/4 inch here. Step 9, I'm going to add the seam for a piece of fabric that'll be placed here. So since I've come around to this side, I'm going to use a different fabric. This is my fabric 3, and I'm going to do right sides down, raw edges even. And again, I'm going to make absolutely sure, as you can see, this is on an angle, so it's deceiving, and when I flip it, it's actually going to come in on an inward angle, and this angle needs to be out. So if you ever run into that, just so it isn't an optical illusion, just square up your fabric at the end, then you can lay it down, and you'll know that you'll have to go about 1/4 inch past where this corner is. So hopefully that's not too confusing. And now we're going to stitch our seam for step 9. And now we can flip our fabric, and we're going to finger press. Adjust this, hopefully you can see better. Finger pressing it and smoothing it out, and we will sew a tack down with the regular thread. And just like before, I'm going to trim to 1/4 inch. Okay, step 11 is another seam, and I'm on the side where there's white fabric, so I'm going to flip my white print right side down, raw edges even. And again, I'm making sure that my fabric, once it's flipped, is going to cover this corner right here. And then I can sew my seam using my regular thread. Just going to snip a thread tail. And then I can flip my fabric right side up, and this is step 12. And I can finger press. Of course I can. And now I'm going to sew a tack down stitch. And then I'm going to trim that fabric to 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, I'm ready for step 13, and that is we're going to put a seam right there with our pink fabric, again making sure that once it's flipped, it's going to cover that area sufficiently. Alright, I got to do a little readjustment since I had to put the hoop on, so now we can sew our seam. And step 14, it'll do a little tack down at this end and another little tack down at the other end. And now I can trim my fabric to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have my seams trimmed to 1/4 inch, and we're going to do a seam here on this side, so I need this color fabric. And I'm putting it right side down with my raw edges even, taking a look at once it's flipped that it covers that corner. So now we can sew the seam with the regular thread. So for step 16, I'm going to flip the fabric right side up. And just like on the other side, it's going to do a little tack down at the bottom and another little tack down. Oh, this one doesn't do a tack down at the top, but it's going to do a little tack down here at the bottom. So now I can cut this to a 1/4 inch seam. This is the last piece of fabric, and it's going to be the white. So we're going to do right side down, raw edges even. Going to move it a little bit over on the right to make sure I have my coverage I need. And we're going to do the seam with regular thread. Okay, there will not be a tack down for this step. That will be taken care of on the next step because we're going to add our backing fabric to the back first. Okay, it's time to add our backing fabric, so I'm just going to center it right over the triangle and make sure that I have the equal amount of fabric on all 3 sides and gently touch that so it stays stuck to it. And then you can flip your hoop over, and I always like to peek underneath just to make sure it's still in place. Okay, I've attached my hoop onto my machine and I checked underneath to make sure my backing fabric was still in place. I've also changed out my thread to water soluble, and I'm just going to give a final finger press and hit start, and then the machine is going to sew the tack down stitch to hold the backing in place and also to hold all our fabric on the front where it needs to be. So I'm just going to smooth it out ahead of the foot. And we have all our piecing done on this block, and we have our backing added, so now we can do our quilting. This is step 19. You're going to need to make sure that you change your bobbin thread. This is the quilting portion and the last step of the design. So you will match your needle thread to your bobbin thread. So let me get my bobbin thread in there. I already have my needle thread in. I'm going to bring that bobbin thread to the top. And I checked my backing fabric and it's placed and positioned perfectly. And it's already sewn on there. I'm going to put my hoop on the machine. And I'm also right now going to change so that my automatic needle threader does not work. And I'll tell you why here in a second. So I've turned off my automatic thread cutter. And I'm also going to bring my bobbin thread to the top of my block. And I do those 2 things so that your backing is very neat and it has fewer bird nests on the back. Whoop. I have to say okay on my screen. Okay, so now we can go ahead and sew our quilting. So here is my triangle log cabin block, and like all our other blocks, we're going to be trimming a 1/2 inch from the basting stitch. So I'm going to line up my 1/2 inch mark with that basting stitch, and then I'm going to cut through all layers. And we're going to talk about this here in just a second. Let me get all the sides trimmed up. And that's a 1/2 inch through every layer. Okay, so I'm going to get back to this here, and over here we have the battleizer showing and the fabric did not cover it. But that's okay, because when we join these blocks together the way we're going to do it, it's going to have sashing on the front and on the back, so it won't matter if this isn't covered. So don't worry about that. As long as you have at least 1/4 inch that goes beyond the basting stitch of fabric, you're all set. So that's our log cabin block.